Welcome to the first part of a two-part series on the demobbed men of Britain, a word that for a certain generation was part of everyday speech, a process that most men in Britain that lived between 1914 and 1960 would encounter. This first video will deal with the demobbing process of the First World War, which would serve as the origin of the process that would be hugely unpopular and archaic by the time of the late 40s and the Korean War. The British military has always followed the same doctrine ever since the New Model Army of the mid-17th century. That is, a small, well-trained military to enforce the will of the island when economic might did not suffice. This force can expand rapidly into a conscript army that would rival the size and power of the great European powers. This has happened, of note, on three occasions, being the Peninsular Wars of the Napoleonic age and the two World Wars. The Napoleonic Wars is an exception, as while the army did rapidly expand, it was still for the most part a professional army. So the problems we are about to touch on weren't really present. For the other two wars, however, the British faced the unavoidable problem that accompanies the cost-efficient approach to military number, and that of course is demobilisation. What do you do with a large force of volunteers and conscripts when the war is done? As historian Richard Grobard so aptly contends, a conscript army, while effectively solving the manpower issue of modern war, by its very nature brings its own raft of issues. For a conscript army, in all truth, it's simply a civilian army that for the period of time that its existence is necessary is placed under military jurisdiction. When this period of time is up, the civilian army expects to be treated as such civilians released from service. As we will well soon see, this, in both 1918 to 20 and 1945 to 49, was a massive issue for the British government, and there were some pretty incredible ideas floated to solve this issue, and it was much harder to get them out than in. World War I. The Great War was the first real war of national mobilisation since the age of Napoleon, and the government was very quick to treat it as such. Unlike the Second World War, where the army was majority conscripted, the Great War had a majority volunteer army, but volunteers also needed demobilised. Conscription, however, was introduced in January 1916, and only a matter of months later, under Edward Montagu, the radical liberal politician, a subcommittee of the Reconstruction Committee was formed to deal with the question of demobilisation when it should arise. In 1917, Montagu's subcommittee was reformatted and given greater importance, now named the Committee of Demobilisation in the Army. In conjunction with the War Office, the Admiralty, the Air Ministry, and the Ministry of Labour, a plan was formed. Instead of demobilising entire units, which would have been the case otherwise, instead individuals would be demobilised. This was for two reasons. First, while unit demobilisation would have been prudent in the earlier years, when most units were generally geographically homogeneous, with their men coming from the same towns and villages, this was not the case anymore, even by 1916. Many had been so thoroughly battered by war, the level of integration and reconstruction of different units meant that most regiments could very, very easily contain men from the four corners of Great Britain and Ireland. The slightly more controversial justification was that releasing on an individual standard would allow men to be released from service on the basis of the value of their labour and not time of service, with a coal miner being released sooner than a shopkeeper, and a shopkeeper in turn being released sooner than a man with no prospect. The controversy here, of course, was that conscription in the first place was done in the identical order, but in reverse, meaning a coal miner was one of the first to be released and very last to be conscripted. The government had a hard choice ahead: popularity and fairness, or efficiency. They chose the latter. Conscripts and volunteers were split into 5 groups, in the following importance. The most important group was the demobilisers. This was a class of men who would, in the civilian world, expedite the process of demobilisation. This included men who had logistical and civil service backgrounds. They were to be released before demobilisation even began. The second group was named the pivotal men. These were men whose return home would create work for the rest of the servicemen. This group consisted of business owners and foremen. They were also responsible for retooling industry back to peacetime production. They were also released before general demobilisation. The third group was to be first of the general demobilisation. These were named the slip men. They were those with definite important employment opportunities when they returned home, and they had their own internal ranking of precedence depending on the perceived importance of their industry. The fourth group were also termed slip men, although a distinction was made clerically. These were men who held the same skills as those in the third category, but didn't have guaranteed important employment waiting for them. These men were ranked internally in a similar precedence to the third category, as it was expected that due to Reconstruction, work would open for them eventually. These men usually had longer services than the third category. The fifth and final category were the non-slip men. These were men with jobs that were deemed to be unimportant to the Reconstruction effort, or with no prospects for jobs at all. Controversially, however, this category contained many of the longest-serving veterans of the army, as this group contained the bulk of the survivors of Kitchener's army, which in itself was made up of many young men who had not yet entered important industries or were midway through apprenticeships or education. Volunteer men who had been deemed of sufficient industrial significance for the war effort had actually already been demobilised in 1916 when conscription was introduced. When released, these men would be sent to a camp behind the lines of where they were stationed and then shipped off to a depot near their home district. What is important to note, however, demobilised soldiers already on leave or deployed in the UK could not just go home. They would have to follow the process laid out for soldiers deployed overseas to ensure equity and to prevent animosity between those deployed in-country and those deployed overseas. He would then be given 28 days' pay, a ration book, and a rail warrant. For 20 weeks after his demobilisation, he would be given an unemployment salary of 29 shillings a week, lasting for 20 weeks, much higher than the minimum service pay of an infantry private in 1914, 1 shilling and 1 pence. This, funnily enough, was only 1 pence more than a private in Wellington's army would earn, exactly a century earlier. This level of wage stagnation seems utterly staggering to us today, but it is important to note that in this century, the value of the shilling had actually increased rather than decreased, meaning the shilling the World War I soldier was paid served to be about 40% more valuable than the shilling of his Napoleonic counterpart. This pay, however, would later be upscaled dramatically by 1915. How fast were the men demobilised exactly then? And to add to that, how many were actually demobbed? Well, when the war ended, men were still needed. The Treaty of Trianon, Versailles, and Saint-Germain-en-Laye still had not been signed, and wouldn't be for another year. Lloyd George had made a statement that, quote, the fighting was over, but the war was not, quote. And the British were really stuck between a rock and a hard place. They had committed 20,000 men to Russia, and despite promises from the government, this was liable to spin out of control at any moment, while the Germans still had not yet demobilised, leaving the British in a very difficult position. As long as Germany still had her men and her arms, Britain could not well get rid of her own. Now, under the backdrop of rising tensions and protests, General Douglas Haig and Winston Churchill got together to create the Churchill Plant. Out of the 3.5 million British soldiers, 900,000 would need to be retained for post-war duties. For the 2.4 million soldiers who would not be retained, they would be demobbed through the aforementioned process, and as such, they leave our story. But for the 900,000 men left, it doesn't quite end here. They were selected and sorted through on a new, slightly different process. It was a mix between the previous British industrial priority, demob system, and the French process, which was to prioritise age, military service, and combat experience. There were a number of criteria to be one of the unlucky million. First, one must have enlisted after December 1915. This excluded much of Kitchener's army and old professionals, if any were left. 2. They had to be under 37, and so older conscripts, or again, long-serving veterans, were to be sent home. And lastly, they had to possess fewer than 3 wounded stripes. Wounded stripes were brass straws to be pinned to the tunic sleeve of a soldier after being wounded, and each would lead to a pay increase and, of course, recognition of duty. This measure of exemption was both a reward for service and also because It was the most surefire record the army had to measure frequency and length of specifically combat duty. For men who did not meet these requirements, they were to be demobbed. But there was an issue with the system. 2.4 million men met these requirements, much, much higher than the 900,000 required. So how indeed did Churchill plan to sort again? Well, it was done through a progressive tightening of the criteria. First, men of 36 and older were exempt, then 35, then 34. Then it became 2, not 3 wounded stripes, and so on. This was continued until the army was at the level of 900,000 men. And when it became gradually possible to release those 900,000, the process would once more be employed, again tightening the belt, so to speak, slowly restricting the size of the army further and further. An important point to note is, men that were excluded this way were not immediately demobbed. They were simply excluded from military service and would enter the pool of demobilisation previously mentioned, where they would be further sorted into the 4 categories of men: slip men, non-slip men, etc. Many men also refuted their demob or exclusion orders. If a man was outside the criteria to serve on but wished to do so, he could. Despite being usually older than the men who would be compelled to stay, the army did recognise the value in volunteers, and so men could very, very easily stay on if they wished. While it was an inherently fair scheme, and as Churchill put it, one that served the oldest, the ones who came the earliest, and the ones who suffered the most, there were a couple of flaws. Firstly, and most glaring, was the fact that technically, as the system was an extension of the previous demob process, it broke the Liberals' own legislation and promises. It extended conscription far beyond what was promised, and the fact this was introduced only 6 weeks after the general election was seen as an unforgivable rollback by the Liberals, on a promise they had made years ago and reconfirmed only 6 weeks prior at the general election. But despite constant political fighting with the Labour Party and the miners' strike, industrial action that was putting off strong pressure on the government, by June 1919, demob was working. 112,000 officers had been demobbed, or 55% of those who were due to be released. In the same period, 2.8 million men had been released from active duty, or 78.8%. This, as you may be able to tell, is eating into the 900,000 that were due to be retained. This is because that number of 900,000 was constantly decreasing due to both German demobilisation and increasing pressures from Labour opposition. The plan was just as effective in the Navy and the Air Force. At the time of war's end, the Navy held 415,000 men. Of this, about 36,000 were officers. By April 1919, 8,200 and 168,000 men had been demobbed, and of the remaining, only 3,000 officers and 3,000 men were sailors who were eligible for discharge, i.e. men who were willing to serve indefinitely. The naval numbers are similarly reflected in the Air Force. By February 1920, having demobbed 24,000 officers and 250,000 men. By this same date, the success of Churchill's plan for the army was greatly apparent. The army had demobbed 148,000 officers and 3.5 million men. Only 125,000 men remained in the army, and 94% of these were volunteers. Churchill's plan had helped demob near enough 4 million men in the space of a year. This success sadly would not be replicated in the Second War, but that's a story for another time. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed, please like and subscribe. I'm a pretty new channel, and any support is greatly appreciated. I really hope you enjoyed, and please leave any feedback in the comments.